Here we are for a brief review of the Catechism in brief sections, 479 to 483. These are really centered on Christology and the profession of faith in Christ as true God and true man. So I want to map out a couple of things and think about some of the considerations. Historically, when we're thinking about this phrase, true God and true man. Let's make that an E. True God and true man. We think a lot about these two particular figures. Saint Cyril of Alexandria is the key for most people. And a lot of what we're looking at are definitions which are made in the 5th century, in the 400s. And the two councils there are the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. They meet in 431 and 451. And they're considered the 3rd and the 4th ecumenical councils. Now, Cyril is mostly concerned with this guy who was actually a patriarchal archbishop, and he was deposed, Nestorius. And sometimes you'll hear about Nestorius or Nestorianism. And so I just put those up there in order for us to think a little bit more about the historical context, and that'll be helpful sometimes to remember things. Now, Nestorius had this idea. It more or less amounts to an alternating Jesus. And the language here is pretty difficult, so we'll work through a little bit of it. I think you'll get it easy, but we talk about person and nature, but I think the original is probably a little bit more clear if we think about character and characteristic. And you can see why it gets confusing, because what's the difference between a character and a characteristic, right? And, if you're looking at the Gospels and just reading the Gospels, you might be tempted to say something like, hey, look, there's Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus, right? So weeping at the tomb of Lazarus would be a characteristic. And then we'd ask ourselves, of whom is that characteristic, or what kind of character would weep at the tomb of Lazarus, right? So here's someone crying, and then that characteristic seems to indicate this character is human, right? But then we'd have another characteristic, like just a few minutes later, Jesus resurrects Lazarus from the dead, right? And so it's there's a characteristic able to raise someone from the dead. What kind of character can do that? Oh, God, right? And so we keep looking at human and divine character. And Nestorius gets kind of confused because he's thinking, I can only ever see Jesus portraying one set of characteristics at a time. And so it looks like sometimes he's using his human characteristics and other times he's using his divine characteristics. So how can I keep the same Jesus? How can I make sense of the Word become flesh, God truly entering time and taking on a human? Well, for Nestorius, it seems like you have to get very specific if you're going to ask the technical question, and you have to say, what was happening here is Jesus was being human, and what was happening there is Jesus was being divine. Now, the rubber meets the road, so to speak, for Nestorius, because he wonders, if you can separate character and characteristics, if each set of characteristics tends to point to a different character, then what do we make for a title like Mary, right? And Mary, of course, is the mother of God. Well, who has a mother? Nestorius asked this question, and it seems pretty obvious. Only humans have a mother. And so the title, Mother of God, is just technically inappropriate, right? It doesn't work because God doesn't have a mother. All right, but Cyril says, we've got this long history of praying with Mary as the mother of God. This seems to be what's revealed in the incarnation. If Jesus really was human, then he really did have a mother. And so Cyril says, I don't think that you can separate the same character from the different characteristics. In other words, where Nestorius was kind of saying, hey, there's a set of characteristics human and a set of characteristics divine, they each run to the same, a different character, right? That you would have two characters and two characteristics. Cyril says, no, I think there's really one Jesus. And that Jesus Christ has two sets of characteristics, human and divine. Now, later, in the thick of this argument, I think you can see why it is such an argument because of the shades between character and characteristic. Later in the debate, people realize it's really helpful to think about nature and person. And so we come up with that language, one person, two natures. That's the end of the debate between Cyril and Nestorius. Now, I know I'm being in some senses irresponsible as a historian of this era. There's a lot more going on. It's not as straightforward as all of that, but that's a pretty good overview map of kind of the beginning of the controversy and perhaps the end of the controversy, what's hashed out at Ephesus and Chalcedon, and we come up with this: Jesus is a single person who has two natures. That's why Mary is the mother of God, because Jesus is both human and divine, and that both and becomes essential to do proper Christology. All right, so Jesus is true God and true man, unity of a divine person, and that makes him unique. Jesus is the only human person who's also divine, the only divine person who's also human. This is, in essence, a complete break in metaphysics, right? No philosophical system properly makes sense of this because it doesn't seem to work, right? This relationship between person and nature is unique in the person of Jesus Christ. That's part of the mystery of the incarnation, part of the mystery of Christology. So, in other words, Cyril and Nestorius, and particularly Cyril through Chalcedon, they arrive at this understanding of we have to use these technical terms. They're helpful for us because they frame what we're discussing, but they do not plumb the depths of the mystery. They do not explain everything. They just help us name the kind of mysterious thing that happens in the incarnation. All right, I hope that helps lay out some of the paradigms. We got to think about one other thing. In what sense, then, is Jesus mediator, in between? And this is important. Jesus is at the same time human and divine. I want to redraw that in a slightly different pattern, because what most people are thinking is, you have God and you have human. Now, these are distinct, right? And so like the Father, the Son, the Spirit, and all the humans, there's some kind of gap between these. In fact, it's like an infinite chasm, right? God is creator and we are creature. And so there's a big distinction. Now, normally, you might think of a mediator, a go-between right here, as being a third thing. So when we get all of the mediator language, and that's in the New Testament, we tend to imagine that there are now three things on the page, right? God, Jesus, and humanity. Or we make of Jesus a third thing, often referred to in the Latin as a tertium quid. But that's precisely what Catholics are not saying. Jesus is not a third thing. Rather, Jesus is the unique person who is the overlap of God and humans. And so there's not some third thing. There remain only two things, right? Human and God, or human and divine. Jesus happens to have both. And that is part of the mystery. That is part of the truth of God, which perhaps we cannot express fully even in human language, which we can only come to understand if we truly love him. This means that the incarnation, the Catechism says, is the mystery of the wonderful union of the divine and human natures, not creating something new, but actually uniting that chasm, which we said existed before, between creature and creator. This is why Jesus becomes the ladder or the bridge. If we had thought about this before in our map, we were saying you have God and human, and there's some kind of break, right? There's this boundary, and above you have creator, and below you have creature. How does the creature become one with the creator? Well, you can't cross this gap on your own. And the understanding of the incarnation then is that God comes to us, becomes human, and then that allows us to cross and return to God. And so it's in the person of Jesus that we have the mystery of the wonderful union, the mystery of redemption, the means by which humans can enter union with God.